Before we jump in to today's reading and the story there, I believe it'd be helpful if I provided a little background information on the story, and I think you'll find it interesting. First of all, I'd like to begin with a date. For me, one of the most helpful dates in biblical history to keep memorized in my head is the year 1000 BC. Easy number to remember. That is the time of the rule of King David over Israel. 1000 BC, 1,000 years before Jesus Christ. Before the time of David, there was no recognizable kingdom of Israel. Yes, there was King Saul, but he was more of a military leader. Before David, Israel was just the people known as the Hebrews, who had come from Egypt. And politically, they are best described as a loose confederation of tribes. With David as king, however, Israel begins to develop a unique identity. Now, about 200 years before David, 1200 BC, another group of people arrived in this part of the world, and we know them as the Philistines. And despite their strong presence in the Bible, very little is known about these people. They left no written records. However, there has been DNA research, which has been conducted fairly recently, that indicates that the Philistines originated in Greece or some part of southern Europe, and that they migrated east. Now, the Philistines were a seafaring people who settled in the region, first on the coast and then moved inland. They settled in the region that today comprises Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. The Egyptians called these people the Peliset. The Hebrews called them the Peloshet. And it's from that latter term that the region gets the name Palestine. Palestine's named after the Philistines. According to the biblical text, the Philistines moved from the coast inland into Israel's hill country, fighting the Israelites for control. And along the way, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, and they destroyed the great shrine at Shiloh. Technologically, the Philistines were far superior to the Israelites, especially when it came to weapons of war. The Philistines, you see, had mastered the production of iron, and this made them a formidable foe. The Philistine threat is probably why the Israelites called for Saul to be their king, to be a military leader who would consolidate Israel's defenses against the Philistine incursion. At that time, defeat at the hands of the Philistines, it may well have erased this infant Israel from existence altogether. So the stakes were high. Our reading for today, as I said, is the entirety of chapter 17 in the book of 1 Samuel. And I didn't read all of it to you, but I certainly hope that you will take the opportunity today, tonight, to read and maybe even reread this wonderful story. Here, in this chapter, we find the Philistines and the Israelites facing off for battle. The Philistines occupy the mountain on one side of the valley, and on the other side are the Israelites on their mountain. The Israelites are led by Saul, and they are entrenched there, waiting for the Philistines to do something. And it was the practice of armies at this time, mostly to sit and wait, just hoping that the other side would give in or show weakness or simply get tired and leave. And that appears to be the case here, with each army firmly entrenched on their side of the valley. But in addition to the waiting, each day there was another event. Each day, a man named Goliath would emerge from the Philistine camp and challenge an Israelite, any Israelite, to come out and fight with him. Champion against champion, mano a mano, fight to the death, winner take all. The fate of Israel would rest on that one champion. Now, Goliath was a huge, imposing man. He is described as either being, depending on how you do your conversion, 6 feet 9 inches or 9 feet 9 inches. Probably 6'9", but He was also heavily armored head to toe with armor. He had a helmet, a coat of mail, leg guards made of bronze. He carried a massive bronze spear as well as a sword. His armor alone is estimated to have weighed 125 pounds. He was a human tank. And every day for 40 days or more, he would emerge from the ranks of his army and loudly challenge an Israelite to come out and fight him. And there was a lot of trash talk going on as well. He would taunt the Israelites, which was increasingly detrimental to their morale. They did not think that they could beat him or the army. Having been introduced to Goliath, the story then shifts to David. And we are reminded here that David is one of the 8 sons of Jesse of Bethlehem. Now, Jesse's 3 oldest sons are encamped with Saul's army. And it's David's job as the youngest to stay home and watch the sheep, but also to carry provisions to his brothers on the front line. David is doing this when he's at the camp one day as Goliath comes out and makes his daily challenge. And David also hears the rumors that if anyone does manage to defeat the giant, that King Saul will shower that person with wealth, offer his daughter in marriage, and best of all, free his family from having to pay taxes. David, that's true. You laugh, but I'll take door number 3, if possible. David starts asking if indeed these rumors are true, and then he states, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God?" Word of David's comments reach King Saul, who then sends for this brave and opinionated person. And once in the king's presence, David volunteers to fight the Philistine. He says to the king, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul points out that David's just a boy and has no experience in battle while Goliath has been training his entire life. But then David pulls up his resume on LinkedIn and shows the king that he's been working as a shepherd for the past several years. And as a shepherd, his responsibilities include defending his flock from lions and bears. He also rates himself highly at problem solving, creative thinking, and conflict resolution, as well as noting his experience with Microsoft Excel. He was a very busy shepherd. And then, speaking to the king, David reveals his motive for going up against Goliath. This Philistine is not just defying the army of King Saul, he is defying the armies of the living God. And David proclaims that God, this same living God, will protect him, just as God protected him from the wild animals that he faced as a shepherd. So, Saul, for some reason, gives David his blessing, and as well as his armor. But the king's armor is far too large and unwieldy for the shepherd boy who's never worn anything like this before. So David removes it and sets it aside. And then the now unarmed David picks up his shepherd's staff and his sling, and he goes to the riverbed and collects 5 smooth stones, and he places those in his satchel. And he goes out to meet the Philistine. And the two approach the battle line, and as they get closer, Goliath sees how young David is, and he starts to mock him. Goliath asks, "Am I a dog that you've come after me with sticks?" Because that's how he saw David, as no more than just a stick that was beating a dog. And then Goliath goes on. He curses David by his own gods. And he says finally to the boy, "Bring it on. You will be bird food when I'm done with you." But remember, David is the youngest of 8 boys. He's been taunted all his life. These words of Goliath mean nothing. And he turns around and he says to the Philistine, probably as he says to his brothers, "You can come at me with weapons, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will make bird food of you, so that all will know that there is a God in Israel." And the two combatants draw closer, and David reaches into his bag and pulls out a stone. He places the stone in his sling. He launches it at the Philistine, striking him in the forehead, which happens to be the only part of his body not covered in armor, and the giant falls to the ground dead. But there's more. Then, this is the part we don't include in Vacation Bible School. David goes over to Goliath and takes his sword and cuts off his head and holds it up and takes it back to his side. And the Philistine army, seeing their champion dead and beheaded, they flee, and the Israelite army gives chase. Now, the common interpretation of this story is that of the underdog, the shepherd boy against the fierce warrior. And on paper, David doesn't stand a chance, does he? You would never bet on him against Goliath. But from a perspective of faith, nothing could be further from the truth. David did not go out and face the giant unarmed and unprotected. He went out dressed in the armor of God. He knew that his God would be with him and would protect him, and he was fighting for the soul of his people because their future hung in the balance. First and foremost, above all things, David was a shepherd, anointed by God to one day become king. But those years were far off, but he would be a king of God's choosing. And David went before that Philistine, armed not with the advanced weaponry of swords and spears, but with the tools of an Israelite shepherd. Tools he knew and understood. Not fancy iron and bronze, but leather and rock. Last week, in the first installment of this sermon series, we looked at the story of David's anointing by the prophet Samuel. And in that moment, God poured out God's Spirit upon the young David. And then 1,000 years later, we would see this pouring out repeated as God's Spirit is poured out upon the followers of Christ at Pentecost. And we are the recipients of that very Spirit as well. We, too, have been anointed as that Spirit comes down to us. And as one's anointed, we are sent out into the world to share the good news of salvation that we find in Jesus Christ. And we share the good news with our words and with our deeds. And if that sounds like a daunting task, it doesn't have to be. Because just as David was assured that he was protected by God, when we go out, we can do so with the same assurance that God is not only with us, but has also equipped us for the task at hand. You know, there's that old saying that God won't give you more than you can handle. I disagree with that. I like to think that God routinely gives us more than we can handle, and that God has prepared us and anointed us for the task that we cannot accomplish alone. David would never claim that he stood out on that battlefield all by himself. He knew that God was with him. And it's through our challenges, it's through facing the giants in our lives that as people of faith, we can grow in faith. By giving us more to do than we can do alone, we become stronger. David, the shepherd boy, would in time become king, and he will be God's king and shepherd over God's people, just as God chose him to be. And we may not be kings ourselves, but we can certainly be God's shepherd people in this world. We are sent out by God, anointed by God, tasked by God to slay the giants that we find. So I would charge you this day to go out and find your giant. Amen.